Hello, everyone. Just wanted to note that we'll be getting started shortly. We're just allowing some time for more people to join in.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to the webinar, especially on a Friday afternoon. My name is Dee Adams. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a human rights advisor for USAID Namibia. I just wanted to welcome everybody to the webinar on proposal development for human rights grants. We wanted to create this webinar with our partners, our local partners called ASAP, and they will introduce themselves as we go. And ASAP is our local capacity development partners. And we came up with an idea to support the community on developing and responding to human rights grants applications, especially coming from the USAID side. So our partners ASAP really put together this great webinar to show you how best to do that, some of the sharing best practices. So we hope that this will support you in your future proposal development plans. So yeah, so I'll just hand it over to ASAP. Melissa?
Great. Thank you so much, Dee, for the introduction. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Melissa Montes. I am a senior program officer on the ASAP 2 project. I'm just going to kind of go over a few housekeeping things for the webinar, and then I'll pass it over to my colleague, Sean, who will make introductions on our presenter today. Just a few quick notes. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Go ahead and tell us your name and your job position and what organization you're from in the chat so we can kind of get to know who's here today. At any time throughout the webinar, if you have questions, please use the Q&A box to ask any questions. Myself and the rest of the panelists will be monitoring that Q&A box so we can make sure to answer your questions. You can also feel free to use the chat box for answering any questions asked by the presenters or with conversing with each other. Feel free to use that chat however you'd like. We'll also have 2 polls today during the webinar. Those will be questions that our presenter will be asking you all. So feel free to participate. Those will pop up right on your screen at designated times. Additionally, today, our presentation is being recorded and will be saved on our YouTube page for you all to reference in future. So if at any time you wanted to raise your hand to ask a question verbally, please just note that this recording, this session in this webinar is being recorded, and that recording will be posted to YouTube. And we'll be sending that link out to you by the end of the day today. For any additional resources, USAID and ASAP have broadcasted over 100 webinars for more than 21,000 attendees in 76 different countries. And most of those are available to you at the intrahealth.org/ASAP resources page. And we have a few others on business development if you're interested in further resources. We also have several upcoming webinars. January 16th, next week, we'll have a webinar on your role in reporting fraud, as well as future webinars on leadership and governance and USG rules and regulations. So feel free to inquire about those, and we can get you registered and signed up if you'd like to attend those as well. We also have communities of practice that are available to join. This link will take you to the site to register. In English, we have monitoring and evaluation and leadership and governance, as well as some in French and Portuguese. I'm now going to pass it over to my colleague, Sean, who will continue with introductions.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you, Dee, for the introduction. My name is Sean Aldridge. I am a Senior Program Manager with IntraHealth International and the ASAP2 project. And I just want to very quickly introduce our presenters for today. Rebecca Bowler is a business development consultant that we work with. She's done some great work with us and for us before, including presenting at the 4th annual USAID local partners meeting in Johannesburg in 2022. And so she's going to be providing the bulk of today's webinar. Also, our colleagues Vicky Hayes McGee and Abdullah Mashausi will be on hand to provide some information on fixed amount awards and use of the de minimis. Also, as you know, Dee is here, as well as Laura Muzart, both from USAID. They may have some things to note during the course of the webinar. Also joining us is Ron McInnes from Palladium Epic project. And so if needed, he's on hand as well. So without further delay, I would like to turn this over to Becky. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, everyone, for the great introductions. Welcome, everyone, to the webinar. I hope you'll find this informative and a place to ask questions and get answers to any of those burning questions you have as you're responding to different requests for applications. So we're going to go ahead and get started with a couple of poll questions here. So I think Melissa will be, they should be displayed on your screens now. So the first poll question we have is, has your organization responded to USAID funded EOI or requests for applications before? And that's either directly to USAID or through a USAID project prime partner. And then the second question, there's a few different pieces, but I want to kind of gauge, what aspects of the proposal application development process are you most concerned with or least concerned with? So there's a few different questions there to kind of gauge, what are you most concerned about? What would you like more help with? And what are aspects that you feel like you have a good handle on? So I guess, Melissa, you can let me know. We can wait, a minute or so and let you answer those questions, and then we'll move forward.
Yeah, we'll just give folks just a minute or two to answer those questions.
All right, so we have the results here. So it looks like about half of you have submitted applications for funding to USAID or through USAID partners. So that's a good amount there. And just taking a look at what is kind of concerning or what you're most concerned about putting applications together. So it looks like on the first question, having adequate staff and resources to pull the application together by the deadline. That's certainly something that organizations of all sizes worry about, but I'm sure, with small local organizations like yourselves, doing that work with your communities, that can be a challenge. It seems like understanding the requirements of the application for submission, it's of somewhat concern, but not identified as a top concern. And the same goes for explaining and designing your technical approach. So that is good there. And let's see, the fifth question here, developing the budget, that's also can be challenging and something we'll go over today, some tips and best practices for that. Certainly understand that. And then understanding and implementing the eventual award mechanism, for example, a fixed amount award, excuse me. So it does look like that could be an area of concern for some of you, but perhaps you've worked through those before. So, all right. Well, thanks so much for indulging me in a couple of those questions. And we'll go ahead and dive into the objective and agenda. So today we're really going to be sharing the objective of the webinar today is to really provide you all with practical tips and suggestions for reviewing and responding to human rights related funding solicitations and developing those related proposals. And as mentioned before, a link to the webinar recording and presentation materials will be shared later in case we're going through anything too quickly or you want to review anything we discussed. Our agenda includes several sections on best practices for different areas of the proposal development process. First, we'll talk about best practices for reviewing application requirements and organizing yourselves to respond. And then we're going to talk more specifically about, responding to the technical application requirements and meeting those evaluation criteria. Then we'll take a pause for Q&A. So as I'm going through the presentation, again, please insert your questions into the Q&A box and we will get to those as we take that pause. And then the second half of the presentation, we will talk about best practices for responding to the cost application requirements, and then finish out with how to finalize your application and submitting it to the donor. And then finally, we'll end with another Q&A session to make sure we get to all your questions and have a bit of time for discussion. So we'll jump right in. And, first and foremost, and I know this is probably really obvious to everyone, reviewing the documents. When you see that call for applications, call for proposals, requests for applications, I'm going to use kind of all these different terms interchangeably, but at the end of the day, it's a call for proposals, a call for you to submit an application for funding. So the donor or the funder will post or supply you with documents letting you know what are the requirements, what are they looking for, what is the evaluation criteria. So first and foremost, reading and reviewing all the documents top to bottom is really important. And that goes for everyone working on the proposal. And even if your role is to, say, work on the budget, it's still really important for you to understand what they're looking for in the technical side of the application, to understand, the different pieces of the eventual award and how to respond appropriately. So it's just really important to go back to those documents and to keep going back to them throughout the process that you're working on the application to make sure you're referencing back to what the requirements are. And so some best practices and tips and things to take note of, those important dates and deadlines. The first thing I do as a proposal manager is look at that final deadline and thinking, okay, how much time do we have to put our application together? And then, identifying those intermediary dates and deadlines, whether it's internal or from the donor For example, you should be given an opportunity to ask questions about the solicitation documents. If things are unclear or contradictory, or something was maybe left out, it's a chance to ask those questions, and we'll kind of go through some best practices on that aspect in a couple of slides. Next, you really want to pay attention to the award information, and this would include the period of performance for the activity. You know, is it a 1-year project? Is it a 5-year project? What is the award amount, the dollar value of the grant? You'll also want to take a look at the eligibility requirements that will indicate to you, you know, if the funder is looking for local organizations only, or is it open to competition from other INGOs as well? That will give you an idea of who your competition is, especially for these competitive applications that you're putting in. And, you know, going along with that, making sure you're eligible to apply, you know, you're meeting those eligibility requirements first and foremost. And then taking a look at the application instructions. So you'll find with many US government application requests, they give you information on the format that the application should be in, even to the font size, the font type. They will tell you the outline that it should follow, give you page limits, etc. So there's a lot of small details in these solicitations giving you instructions on how to put your proposal together. And then finally, and really most importantly, probably is, you know, it's going to tell you what are the evaluation criteria. So this is indicating to you how the donor or the funder will evaluate your proposal and what you need to do to meet those criteria. So it's really important to pay attention to those evaluation criteria and to put your proposal together in a way that the donor can go through and, you know, check mark, yes, this applicant is letting us know what their technical approach is. They're showing that they've done this work before, but whatever those evaluation criteria might be. And if you have any ideas on other considerations when you're reviewing solicitation documents, please feel free to put those in the chat. I certainly didn't cover everything here, but in my experience, these are some of the most important items to pay attention to. And so when you get these, you know, a call for funding, a call for applications, it's important to kind of think about, okay, you know, this is really exciting. We really want to get funding for this, but kind of taking a step back and really looking at some key issues before you make that final determination to put together your application. Because as you know, putting applications together for these calls for funding takes a lot of time and effort and resources, and putting those resources towards an application might take your resources away from something else. So you really want to be sure that this is the right fit and is going to be worth your time and effort. So something to consider as you're reviewing the call, is it within your experience or expertise? You know, have you done this type of work before? Are there any gaps in your experience or your expertise? Is it proposing you work in a geographic area that you haven't worked in before, or perhaps don't have a lot of deep knowledge of? And if that's the case, you know, if you do have gaps, are there partners that you could work with? You know, there's always encouragement for organizations to partner together to, you know, comprehensively meet all of the requirements in the application. So I think rarely donors expect one organization to be able to do everything in any given call for funding. So thinking about partners and how you can leverage partner experience. Something else to think about is, of course, if it's strategic for your growth or expansion of your organization and your mission. And that's probably a no-brainer. But really thinking about, okay, you know, if we go for this and if we were to win, how will this award support our own organization's growth? How will this allow us to do more work with the communities that we serve? And also thinking about, you know, the practicalities of the type of award that might be used for, giving the funds. So, depending on if it's a grant, what type of grant is it? Can you meet the requirements of the donor or the funder in terms of how you implement the project? And, of course, you have to weigh the risks. Is this project or putting together the proposal going to present any risks? And can you mitigate those risks? Are there things that you can do to make sure that when you're implementing the project, you're not going to have an issue of delivering on the goals or the objectives of the project? That's really important. And finally, a big question, as mentioned before, is do you have the internal resources to pull a high quality application together? All of the above bullet points might be, yes, we can do that. It's no problem. It goes towards our mission. But if the deadline is such that, you have a hard time pulling a team together and you have a hard time pulling together that application, it's definitely a consideration to take with you as to whether you'll make a go decision or not. But hopefully, if everything's a yes, all the resources will come together. And I know teams work day and night on proposals to meet those deadlines. And so another aspect of, okay, you've made a go decision, you're going to put together this application. It's really important to organize yourselves internally, in identifying your team and how you're going to meet all of the requirements of the application. So I know a lot of organizations, local organizations are small, and you probably don't have a BD team, a business development team of, 10 people, and you don't have other technical folks that you can pull in to create a large proposal team. So something to think about is identifying staff who can lead or support different functions that are necessary to put the proposal or application together. So you really would be great to have a staff person who can oversee the process management. And what I mean by that is someone who kind of at all times knows what's going on, knows who's working on which piece of the proposal, knows all of your deadlines, knows the deadlines of the donor, and can kind of keep all the cogs and all the wheels running towards that final deadline. It's really important that you have one person who just kind of knows everything that's going on and can answer questions and be a resource for other team members. Then you really need someone who can actually physically put the application together. So that means writing, creating the outline, taking inputs from your technical experts, putting them down on paper and getting them into a format for the donor. And many times, the writer will also be the technical lead. So that could include, depending on the objectives of the project and the work of the potential funding grant, you'll have technical experts who, work in the communities, work in these specific areas. For example, we're talking about human rights grants. So you have your human rights experts, and I'm sure, you have experts who are knowledgeable in the legalities of human rights and how to work with governments. So you'd want someone or several people with those different technical expertise to be inputting. And also keeping in mind M&E, and that's monitoring and evaluation. So many times donors are going to ask you, how are you going to monitor? How are you going to keep track of progress towards the goals and objectives of the project? Then, of course, you have to provide a budget with your application. So you'll need a finance or budgeting expert to work with you to be able to take those activities and, whatever staffing or operational needs you have and getting that all into a budget. And, including your operations or human resources colleagues, again, to inform the budget and how you're going to operationalize the activity. And then finally, having reviewers, for the technical and the budget. You really want to make sure that as you're putting your application together, that you're taking time to stop during the process to take stock of, what you've put together, reviewing it for accuracy, reviewing it against the solicitation documents to make sure that you're responding to what's being required from the donor. And so you've, identified your team, but you realize that you need, perhaps to identify partners and, some best practices and considerations for forming partnerships. I've listed some here. It can be kind of challenging, but I'm sure that you all are well aware of the other organizations working in your field, working in your local communities, and there's often complementary experience that you can leverage. So some things to consider when you're considering partnering is really asking yourself, do you want to prime or sub? And I'm sure you know what I mean by prime or sub, but just in case you don't, prime means that you're taking the lead in putting the application together. You're, putting the budget together, you're deciding how to staff the project, and you're submitting that application to the donor. And ultimately, if you were awarded, you would receive the grant, you would be responsible for implementing the grant and reporting back to the donor. So you're really taking on all the financial and technical responsibility of implementing the project. And if you decide you don't have that capacity, or perhaps the application is not fully in your wheelhouse, you might look for a sub role. You might talk to those organizations who want to prime about giving you a role on their project for perhaps a niche or discrete scope of work. So you would be participating as a partner, you would be included in planning and putting the proposal together and implementing the project, but perhaps for a much smaller piece of that project. So things to consider as you're thinking about partnering is, what are complementary areas that you need to identify? Is it on the technical side? Do you need a partner that works in a specific geographic area, since your organization might not already work there? But you also want to keep in mind if there's overlapping areas as well. You want to make sure you're not stepping on each other's toes, and if you do similar work or work with similar communities, that you're covering as much as possible without providing too much duplication. And then you also want to think about, when you're partnering, finding good partners. So does the organization have a good reputation? Do they have credibility doing this work with the donor or in that particular community? Have they worked with the donor before? These are kind of important considerations just on the practical basis of, does the partner understand, what type of work is being requested and how to implement it. And so after you've kind of considered these and identified different organizations to talk to, I would always suggest having meetings over the phone, in person, to talk with potential partners, talking about the call for applications, talking about those potential areas of collaboration. And then if you, find that this could be a good way to go, of course, you're stronger as a team than going as individual. Then you can agree on your partnership terms and formalize that relationship. So, okay, you've gotten your team together internally, you've identified a partner or two that you want to work with. The next thing is really going back and looking at that solicitation and organizing yourselves, and that includes your partners, to create and get your proposal together. So the first thing I usually do, based on those deadlines that we talked about before, is creating your calendar and ensuring that you're going to meet all those deadlines. So what is the final deadline for application? Any other, deadlines for submitting questions? And then again, identifying your own internal deadlines or milestones. Are you going to have a review of the application in 2 weeks from now? Are you going to do a final review and sign off before you submit it to the donor? You have to decide what those milestones are. And then, of course, giving your staff assignments and deadlines for deliverables. You want to make sure, again, that you're assigning staff assignments within their wheelhouse, within their expertise, and then allowing them to, work on that, but then taking a pause and allowing someone else to review that work. You always want to have those points where you double check each other's work, where you review against the RFA, and making sure that you're really responding to what's being requested from the donor. And during the process, including any partners you've, identified, you want to make sure that you're getting partner inputs, you're including them in any discussions about the technical approach you might be putting together. Stay organized and, using any tools that you might have learned from ASAP to put your application together. And so I've mentioned questions to donors, and I wanted to go through some best practices here. And this is from years of, reviewing applications and formulating questions on the applications. But it's really a chance, again, for you all to go back to the donor and ask clarifying questions about the instructions or any information that might be unclear or contradictory. And a good tip is to always frame the question in a way that the donor can easily answer. And we're going to go through an example of this on the next slide. But just thinking about how you ask a question allows someone to answer it more easily. So, a yes or no question, of course, is much easier than uh, a question that's going to require, well, you have to think about this and what about that? So making the question as simple as possible to answer. And you also should be strategic about the questions that you're asking. You don't want to ask a question, especially if it's competitive. If you know that other organizations are going to be submitting applications, you don't want to ask a question that will give away your technical approach or your strategy or other important information. Because usually with the US government, if you're applying for US government funds, they post all of the questions and answers that were asked. So you're not going to get individual responses on your individual questions. The donor or the funder are going to compile all of those questions and answers and distribute them on a public forum so that anyone can review them, and that includes any of your competition. So you really have to keep in mind, are we asking a question that, we should, is a part of our strategy and we should, answer ourselves, or is a part of our strategy, and we can make an assumption and move forward. So it can take some time to develop this skill, but I'm hoping this next activity will kind of help you see what I'm talking about. So this is just an example. I've pulled it from, I made it up basically, but it's a question that kind of I've encountered several times in my career. So for example, in the technical application, it'll tell you the technical application must be consecutively numbered on each page and must not exceed 30 pages. And the 30 pages do not include the cover page, table of contents, executive summary, and appendices. Okay, those are the instructions from the call for proposals. So just listing them here, it says you need a cover page, it says you need a table of contents, it says you need to include an executive summary and your technical approach, 30 pages. but it doesn't mention anything about an acronym list. And in the proposals that I'm used to putting in, we use a lot of acronyms. And it's helpful to have that first page to say, to list out all the acronyms so that it's clear what you're referring to throughout your application. But an acronym list hasn't been listed as part of, the required pieces of the application. So technically, they're not asking for an acronym list, but it would be nice to have one. And so if you would like to ask a question about the acronym list and if it can be included, which is the better question to ask? So I have some example questions for you to see what I'm talking about here. So one question you could ask is, which sections of the technical application do not count towards the 30-page limit? You could ask that question. Unfortunately, it's just not very specific. It's just not very clear as to what you're asking about. So the donor may get that question and say, well, we told you on page 29 what's required. You can see it all listed there. So that answer still doesn't answer your specific question about whether or not you can include an acronym list. Another potential answer the donor could give, they could say, appendices don't count towards the page limit. And again, that's true, and they've answered your question, but again, it's not specific to your question about an acronym list. And so a better question, but a more wordy question, would be on page 29 of the NOFO, and that's a notice for funding opportunity, application, what have you. It says that the cover page, table of contents, executive summary, and appendices do not count towards the 30-page limit. Can you please confirm that an acronym list may also be included and will not count towards the 30-page limit? And as you can see, this question is very detailed. You're listing what it actually says in the solicitation, and then you're going a step further to ask specifically about that acronym list. And you're asking it in a way that, the donor could say yes or no. So it makes it very easy for the person responding to say like, oh yeah, that's fine. You can put an acronym list and it won't count towards the page limit. Or they might say, no, we don't want these additional pieces. It's not necessary. So no. And then you have your answer. You have a very clear answer from the donor on, what you're allowed to include in your application. So this is just one example. It's a simple example, but I just really want to encourage you as you're asking these questions to, think about it in a way that you can get a clear answer. Because sometimes asking questions can cause more confusion, and that's not what you want to do. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A section if you have any further questions about. So, okay, we've reviewed the call for applications. We've, identified our team. We've talked to different partners. We have a partner on board. And now it's really, we have to get into actually putting our application together. So it's important to really start with that evaluation criteria, and that's usually at the end of the call for application document. And this is just an example that I made up. This isn't, this doesn't have anything to do with any current applications out there right now, but it's pretty typical. You'll see that the donor is illustrating here the different sections of the application. What are the different pieces required? So here we have 4 different sections that are required that they're going to be scoring. And you see over here the scoring rubric. So you see how many points the donor is going to give for each of these sections. So when you're looking at the technical approach, you see that there are 4 bullets that the donor is going to look at and review your application against. So they want to see that your approach is clear, complete, and responsive to the requirements of the project. Straightforward. They also want to see that your approach is innovative, based on best practices, and is likely to achieve the project objectives. And then they also want to see that your application demonstrates an understanding of the context and is an expert on the subject matter. And finally, they want to see that your technical approach clearly articulates what activities will be conducted, how they'll be conducted, where, by whom, and when. So as you can see, just in the technical approach, they're asking for a lot of information. But you can also see in the points value, it's worth 50 points out of 100. So half of your points are going to come from just your technical approach. So you can see the importance that the donor has put on this piece of the application. And you can get from that how much time you should spend on it within the confines of the application's page limits. You can also see here they would like to see a monitoring and evaluation plan that's worth 15 points. And they want to see that it responds to the technical strategy, that it proposes effective and high quality methods of monitoring activities and measuring results and using data to improve performance. And they also want to see that the applicant demonstrates current capacity to collect and analyze data and monitor and evaluate project performance. So as you can see, again, this has 15 points. So not as important as the technical approach, but certainly you don't want to lose 15 points by not addressing this in your application. So it's really important, even for the smaller value pieces of evaluation criteria, that you make sure that you're doing your best to get all of those points. And then they're asking for a management and staffing plan. So this is really where they want to see your management structure and how you're going to staff the project and see that it demonstrates the capability to rapidly start up and achieve the project's objectives. And here they're also referring to key personnel, those key staff in your project who are going to be responsible for implementing the activities, and they want to see that those personnel are experts in their fields and meet minimum requirements of a job description. So again, 20 points would go towards that piece of the project. So it's really important to think about, okay, we have a technical approach. We know how we're going to monitor and evaluate the project as we implement, but the donor also wants to see how you're going to manage the project. What, if you need to open new offices, or if you're going to use your current office and hire more staff. They just really want to see how you're going to operationalize the activities that you've talked about in your technical approach. And then finally, organizational capacity. So this is a section that will really be able to demonstrate your organization's ability to implement a similar project. So they want to learn more about your organization and see that your organization works to implement these types of projects, that you've done these type of projects before and have achieved results, that you've managed donor funds properly before, that you are familiar with the donor, that you know how to implement within the confines of any of the rules and regulations that they require you to follow. And, it's also an opportunity to show that you've worked in the geographic area previously and you've achieved clear results. So again, 15 points. So in total, you can see, the donor is looking for all of these pieces and will be scoring you out of 100 points. So moving on from this, evaluation criteria, the next step is to put your outline together. So some best practices, for creating an outline, which, this is how you really respond, make sure you're responding to the technical application requirements and meeting those evaluation criteria, creating an outline. So that's physically going into a Word document and pulling from the solicitation document the different sections that are required and the different details on what's required. But it also means going back and looking at, okay, what font does it need to be in? What size should it be in? Are there requirements on what size the margins should be? What are the other, other requirements for physically putting this application together? So for example, and it might give you instructions that the font needs to be 12-point font in Calibri with 1-inch margins, and each page should be numbered consecutively. And then once you have that settled, creating the headings for each of those required sections and noting the page limits. So thinking back to those evaluation criteria that we just took a look at, we know the technical approach is worth the most value out of those 100 points. So as you look at the different sections and note how much they're worth, you want to give a good amount of real estate, as in page numbers, to those pieces. So for the technical approach, let's say you have a 20-page limit for putting this application together. For the technical approach, you'd probably give it 10 pages because it's worth 50 points. So that's, 50% of the pages of 20 pages is 10. The monitoring and evaluation section, it's not worth as many points, but you want to give it a fair amount of pages to be able to respond to everything that the application is asking for. And again, with the management and staffing plan, it's worth more points than the monitoring and evaluation. So you might give it an extra page, again, so you can be sure to provide all of the details that is being asked for. And then finally, organizational capability. So you have 3 pages to put them together. So again, this is just really important to share out with your team once it's been created so that everyone who's working on these different sections knows how much space, physical space in the application they have to work on it. You don't want to just give an assignment to someone and say, can you please go write the management and staffing plan? And they come back, a week later and they've written 10 pages. And you say, well, we only have 4 pages available, and you'd have to cut a lot. So starting out with these requirements and giving everyone the parameters to work within will really be helpful and keep the team on track. And so next I want to talk a little bit about putting together your technical approach or your technical piece of the proposal. We'll go through a couple of slides and then we'll be at the Q&A break. So a couple more slides to go before the questions and answers section. So for your technical proposal, some best practices are really thinking about what. So what is the activity? What are the objectives, and as you're trying to achieve those objectives, what are the activities that are going to help get you there? And how? How will this activity or task be completed? What stakeholders or other factors need to be taken into account? So, and this is really challenging even, I would say for any organization putting together an application is being able to explain how. We can say what, it's easier to make a list of activities that you want to do, but really articulating how they're going to be done is really, really important. And then thinking about where is this project taking place and where is the individual activities going to take place? Just being very clear, to show where those activities will take place. And then thinking about who. So that includes whether it would be you as the prime partner implementing or leading activity, or will it be one of your partners? Or is another activity doing similar work and you would work with them to leverage that experience? So it's just, being sure to tell the donor who is doing a particular activity so they know where to look for it, even in the budget. And when? So when is this activity going to take place? Or when is a set of activities going to take place? Will it be in the first month? Will it be in month 6? Will it be in year 4? You really just need to be clear to let the donor know, the sequence of activities that you're going to undertake over the period of performance for the project. And then ensure your technical activities are feasible within the allocated budget. This is a challenge for all organizations putting proposals together. You come up with all these great activities and you want to include your partners and you want to include other stakeholders and you would love to do it over a long period of time. But we all know that this is really constrained by the budget ceiling and how much funds are available to implement said activity. So, you don't want to go crazy, creating a list of 50 different activities if you really only have the budget to implement 20 of those activities. So again, trying to keep, budget numbers in mind and how many funds you have available to implement certain aspects of a project is really important. But I'd say this list is again, going back to the evaluation criteria, is what the donor is looking for. The donor wants to know all of these details so it can understand how you're trying to achieve the goals of the project. And then a few more best practices here, and this is really going back to, how to put together your technical approach. And what I found is holding in-person meetings with a variety of staff, and that would be your own staff, staff from partners, having meetings with stakeholders, people that know, people from the community to understand what the community needs are and, what type of activities or what type of support they need to address certain issues. So holding those in-person meetings with technical experts, partner staff, your operations, finance, HR staff is really important to get all the different perspectives and points of view. And really, part of those discussions is understanding the context of the issues or the context of the problem that you're trying to address. What is happening right now in these communities or at the national level? What is the context that we're working in? And then also thinking about the root causes of those challenges. Why, is this challenge taking place? Constantly asking that question, why? How do we get to the real root of the problem? And once you identify those root causes, flipping it and talking and thinking about what are potential solutions to address those issues. What are those potential interventions that you want to undertake to address and change those root causes of challenges into opportunities to make a positive change. And so then you get to thinking about, okay, we have an idea for how to address this problem. What are some activities or tasks that we can operationalize for the solution? So what kind of activity? Is it a training? Do we need to hold, meetings with a government ministry to discuss a certain issue? Do we need to go into the community and train community members on advocacy or how to advocate for their own solutions at the community level? So it really makes a difference thinking about, okay, we want to implement different activities, at what level they should be implemented. And then also it's important to, again, talk about what staff are needed to implement these activities that you've identified. Do you have enough staff in your organization already to undertake everything? Or do you need to hire additional staff? Or do you need to ask your partners to hire staff to participate? I'm just really thinking about at all levels, what are the activities and how do we action them? And then finally, monitoring those indicators. So going back to the M&E section of this call for applications, what are those indicators that you need to monitor, that you need to constantly be checking in on to show progress? How are you going to identify milestones that show like, yes, these activities are making progress towards our goal? And just practically, when you're having these conversations, when I've facilitated or participated, you use sticky notes, whiteboards, chalkboards, chart paper, anything where you can allow these staff to write down their ideas and post them up for everyone to see. And then usually grouping, physically moving those sticky notes or papers around and grouping them according to the objectives. So that's just kind of a practical, what happens in those meeting rooms when you're designing a project. And if you have any other best practices that you've used in your organization or have seen other organizations, again, please feel free to share those in the comments. And this is our last slide before taking a break. So reviewing the application, I think I've mentioned this a few times of taking the time throughout, if you have 4 weeks to put your proposal together and before the deadline, taking time during those 4 weeks to pause, review what you've already put together, identify gaps of what you might be missing or what you haven't yet responded to from the call for proposals. So one important thing is to define your own organization's review milestones. You might say, okay, in 2 weeks, we need to have a first draft together. And then, a week later, we're going to have a next draft and then review the final draft. It really depends on what you have time for. If you only have 2 weeks to put your application together, that significantly reduces your time that you can take those pauses and make those reviews. But it's still really important to build those in, even if you have a very limited amount of time. And one thing to really remember is the donor can only review what is in your application. The donor is using this probably a competitive process to review your applications. And they really have to only consider what you've put in those 20 pages of your application. They might know your organization from previously working with you, or your organization has a great reputation working in your community, but the donor cannot base their review of your application on that knowledge. They're really just basing it on what you've put in those 20 pages. And if you're responding to the requirements and scoring you on those evaluation criteria. And again, it's really important to follow a consistent process for each review. So giving your reviewers instructions, what do you want them to take a look at? What do you really need support with? And then identifying staff to serve as reviewers. And, hopefully will be separate from the proposal team. So it could be your executive director, perhaps even a board member, someone that you can pull in who understands the donor and understands the content of your application. They'll be able to give you really good feedback on, what's missing, or, what are the good aspects that you've got in your proposal already. So I've just listed here some examples of reviews, and again, this is really referring to internal to your organization reviews. So you always want to make sure you're reviewing your application and making sure it's compliant with donor requirements. You might have, a final review where your executive director pretends they're the donor and they're going through that evaluation criteria and they're going to actually score each of your sections, pretending to be the donor, getting in that donor's shoes and looking at it from the lens of an outside perspective. And then reviewing the budget for accuracy and for reasonable costs, you definitely want to make sure that you're taking time to stop and review the budget against what you've put in your technical application and making sure that your costs are reasonable and accurate for the activities that you're proposing. Another review, again, before it looks nice. At the end of the day, this application is a reflection of your organization and it's in some ways a marketing document. So you just really want to put your best foot forward in the document that you submit. And then, finally, after you've submitted your application, you might want to perform what we call an after action review. That would be used to discuss lesson learned and how to make improvements to your process. So these are just some examples that I've experienced and seen in the organizations that I've worked with. So it's just really up to you, your organization, to decide what will work best. All right, well, we're going to take a pause and take some questions. We can also take questions if you want to come off mute. So I'll turn it over to Melissa, who's going to help facilitate if we have any questions in the chat box.
Yeah, we have one question here, Rebecca, in the chat. And again, to everybody, if you have further questions, feel free to either put them in the chat or the Q&A box specifically. If you'd like to come off mute to ask your question, just raise your hand and we can call on you. And just a reminder that this is being recorded, so others will be able to hear you as you ask your question. But the first question we have is, would it be acceptable to strategically use the larger space in the technical approach to describe an M&E tool at length if you want to keep and reserve the space in the M&E section where this tool is a part of the strategic objective? I think what they're trying to say is if this tool is specifically a part of your technical approach, would it be okay to include it in the technical approach longer section than in the specific M&E section?
Yeah, I mean, it's really your call. I would say, you can definitely mention these tools. And if this tool, specifically is a key part of your strategy or is really going to speak to your technical approach, of course, you can put it in the 10 pages, but you might also decide, 3 pages for M&E isn't enough. So we're actually going to use 4 pages and we're going to devote 1 page to, explaining this tool and showing our experience in that. So it's, it's really subjective and it's really just a judgment call of where you put the importance, and also, trying to balance with what the donor is saying is important part of the evaluation. But, certainly if you decide, we need to make the technical 9 pages and the M&E 4, that's normal as you go through the process. These initial page allocations are always the ideal. And then as you go through the process, as you review and take note, you might find that one's being, you actually need to devote a little more to one section and a little less to another. So it's just really a balance.
Great. Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I just wanted to note there's another part to the question about, is it okay to refer to something,
Okay.
in another section
Yeah,
to
for
save
sure.
space? So I just want to go turn that over. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Sean. Sorry, I missed that. Certainly, it's great throughout your application to refer to the other sections because every section um, is related to each other. It depends on what you're doing in your technical as to how you need to put your M&E together as to how you need to staff your project. So I think it's great when you can refer and cross-reference throughout your application. Let me just double check the question again. Yeah, so certainly in your M&E approach, you'll want to go back to your technical approach and, mention, how you're monitoring or evaluating a certain indicator or a certain piece of information, going back to say, this was on page 4 of the technical approach, and this is how we're going to tackle that issue. So it's always great to go in between. Yeah, Sean.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing, where it's sometimes good to do make those references in one section about something else that's in another section if it's relevant. And that's because sometimes when the donor is reviewing the applications or the review committee is reviewing the applications, different people are assigned to review different sections. And so if they're reviewing the M&E section, but there's something important about the M&E section in the technical, by making a reference, the person who's reviewing that particular section sees that there is something important about their section somewhere else, in case they review the section and go, well, they didn't talk about this or this, but you did talk about it in another section and you made a reference. So that's just another reason sometimes why it can be useful to make a reference in a section.
Thanks, Sean. That's a great point to highlight. Thank you. Do you have any other questions?
Yep, we have another additional question. It says here, most community-based organizations are small and don't have the HR resources used that you mentioned in this presentation. What is some advice for organizations that do not have the capacity but would like to participate in the application process? That's the first part of the question. The second part says, how do we develop newer organizations if the requirements are too technical and cumbersome all of the time?
Yeah, I know that's really something of concern for community-based organizations, being small. Like I said, you don't have, maybe you don't have someone in HR or you don't have someone in finance. Hopefully you do, but I can understand the challenges there. And I would say, specific to an application for funding, this is perhaps where you can leverage partnering with another organization to help with some of these areas. So, if you're finding that the requirements are too cumbersome or you just don't have the staff or the systems in place, it might be a good idea to partner with a larger organization or an organization that have these functions and has the experience applying. It might be a good way for you to kind of, as we say, get your foot in the door, get that initial experience to kind of build your capacity and how to respond. But I certainly understand the challenges and I'll open the floor if others from USAID or others want to make any additional comments on this. I don't know, Sean, did you have anything you'd want to add to that? I know it's a challenge.
It is indeed a challenge, especially for a younger or smaller organization. Sometimes I mean, I think partnering is really is an important strategy. it's certainly a strategy that organizations that I have worked in before have used it, use that. Also, sometimes the solicitation, the EOI or the RFA document will allow you, the organization, to select, a smaller piece of the particular, you say like the geographic area, where you don't have to choose all of the provinces or districts, but maybe you can choose a smaller one that will meet your staffing needs if you can't partner with somebody. But partnering is a really good strategy. And Laura wants to make a comment about this. Go ahead, Laura.
No, and I think what as the ASAP team has outlined is really good advice. I think the idea behind it is that even if you have a very small team, to try to figure out how can you still kind of do the same process, right? So it could be that you are the one person that's helping to write it, but you still want to take a break from what you've done in terms of drafting the proposal and look at it through a different lens, right? So look at the criteria and say, have I really answered all this different criteria? So it's kind of like, what are the best steps and the best practices, even if you don't, like with all systems, right? If you don't have like a larger team, you still want to do some of those best practices, but you just kind of have to figure out what works for what you have. Because I think there's different proposals, both technical cost applications, where overall people are trying to make it where it's more it's something that different levels of organizations can apply to, so that's not a barrier on its own. But I think the point of this is, how do you make sure you have a really strong competitive one? And it is being a little bit more critical, and I think really just understanding that what's in that proposal really is the only thing that's going to be evaluated, and that's kind of hard to look at when you're in the technical portion of it. But I found, like, when I do different things, like I just take a break, and from that's when I'm like, okay, now I'm looking at it with fresh eyes. Now I'm going to look at it from a reviewer point of view. So that's all I would just kind of to outline, because it is a balance in terms of having enough staff to do it in a way that I think has been outlined here, and what can you do in reality.
Thank you, Laura. I'll hand it back over to Melissa and Becky for fielding any other questions or comments.
Yeah, I think we have one more question here. It says, in a consortium-based applications in a network, do you have any pointers on how sub-granting can be managed if some organizations do not meet the finance requirements or thresholds for being a prime? Are consultancy type of agreements or service level agreements acceptable?
This is a tough question, as I'm not a sub-granting or a finance expert on these issues. So I might ask one of my colleagues, Sean or Vicky, to chime in here. We could also save this. We're going to go through some of the budget and award mechanism slides next. So we could also save it after we go through those next slides.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. And why don't we come back to that one after we do the finance and contracting related ones, and then we'll circle back and we'll chime in on that at that time.
Okay. All right. Yes, we will be sure to get back to that. Don't let any of us get away with not answering that. So we're going to go ahead and move forward with the next few set of slides, and then we will have time at the end for additional questions and discussion. So we're really going to tackle here in this section budget best practices. So I just have a few slides on this, and then I'm going to hand it to my colleague to go over some more detailed issues. So, putting your budget together is its own set of requirements and requires a expertise in budgeting and understanding the strategy behind that. But back to basics, going back to the solicitation and reviewing what the budget should include, what it should look like, using provided templates. So you probably will receive an Excel file with the template for the budget. And in that Excel file, that's really where you're going to show and calculate your costs. So, putting in, the salaries of your staff, putting in, what kind of, covering your rent, your portion of your rent, how to cover supplies and equipment, what kind of activities, what are the costs of the activities that you're putting together? Are you putting trainings together? Do you need to travel to the different geographic areas? All of these costs should be put into your budget. And then you'll also be given a Word file and you'll be asked for a budget narrative. So this goes hand in hand with that Excel file, but it will be used to provide explanation and rationale for those costs. So you're not simply repeating the calculation of those costs in your budget, but really providing justification and explanation. And I just want to highlight here that the donor will evaluate your cost proposal and level of effort on 3 points. And these are really key to keep in mind. So first, they're going to look at reasonableness. Are your costs generally recognized as ordinary and necessary? And an example of this is the rental rate for a venue to conduct a training is average. You're not proposing 3 times the normal rate to rent a venue. It's normal, it's average. If you ask 3 different suppliers, they're probably going to give you very similar quotes for those costs. And then, they're going to look if it's allocable. So are those costs being incurred specifically for this award, for this grant, and aren't costs that are unrelated to the implementation of this project? So that would, for example, the project staff use 25% of the office space, so the project is paying for 25% of the office rent. So it's proportional to how much is being used for the project. And then finally, they're going to be looking if the costs are allowable. So costs are not disallowed by the terms of the award. So this kind of gets into the rules and regulations of awards. But for example, U.S. government funds cannot pay for alcohol or entertainment. So those can be covered by a grant. These are not things that are necessary to implement a project, and the donor is not going to, allow you to use project funds for these types of things. So, and all of this, going back to, you have your technical approach, you have your technical proposal evaluation criteria, but the budget is reviewed separately and it is evaluated separately. And there's not really any set criteria or scoring for a budget. It's really just based on these 3 principles for reviewing the cost proposal. And again, close coordination with your technical staff, with, HR, operations, other team members, other partners is really important to successful budget development. You really want to make sure you're covering everything and every cost that you need to cover is captured in that budget. All right, I'm going to hand this over to my colleague Abdullah. I saw Sean come off. I'll pause.
Yeah, no, thank you, Becky. And I was just coming off to ask Abdullah if he is available to come on now.
Yes, Sean, thank you very much. So I'll do the few slides and I'll try to demonstrate on how the 10% de minimis is calculated. Sorry, I'll switch off my video because of my bandwidth. So basically the 10% de minimis, it really depends if an organization has a NICRA, it will not be eligible to apply the 10% de minimis. So this is applicable only if the organization doesn't have existing NICRA with USAID or any other entity that is funded by US government. So in terms of the computation, so normally the 10% is applicable to MTDC. So the short word for MTDC, the longer word for MTDC is modified total direct cost. It means that all direct costs relating to salary, wages, applicable fringe benefit, except for sub-award more than $25,000. And then we'll see other excluded costs like rental cost, tuition, remission, scholarship. If you are undertaking any of this activity, then it needs to be excluded from the computation. So next slide, please. Yeah, so this is an example of the total direct cost, starting from salary, travel, up to other direct cost. You'll see under 5, the subrecipient, one is receiving $110,000. The subrecipient B is receiving 45, and C is receiving 20,000. So you'll see in the guidance, the CFR at 200.68, it says that if any sub-grants is receiving more than $25,000, then we'll exclude the excess amount. So next slide, please, Sean. Yeah, so so what is highlighted here is all the costs which are excluded, so that you can compute the de minimis. You can apply the 10% de minimis on the modified total direct cost. Remember this, including equipment. So if you have bought any equipment relating to project, or you are planning to buy any equipment, so as you all aware that any equipment value in excess of $5,000, then it need to be counted as equipment. So you'll exclude any equipment with a value more than $5,000. And then if there is any refurbishment to the clinic, any participant costs, support cost, subrecipient we're talking about, and then the rental amount. So the total here is $1,490,000. So we'll see in the next slide on how we exclude those costs in yellow. Next slide, please. Yeah, so remember our total direct cost was $1,490,000. So the exclusion is the combination of equipment, which was around $55,000, clinical construction and repairs, 45, participant support, 10,000, and then subrecipient more than $25,000. Remember, there were 2 subrecipients which exceeded $25,000. One was $110,000, and the other one was $45,000. So if you exclude 50,000 out of this total, or 25 per each, then you'll have excess amount of 105, which need to be removed from the total modified cost. So you'll take your total direct cost as you have budgeted in your budget. So, and then excluding 289, you'll have about 1.2 million and 1,000. So, and then you'll apply the 10% de minimis, which will give you about $120,100. and then your total cost will now be your total award cost will now be $1,049,000 plus the indirect cost, which is 10%, around 120,100. So your total award cost would be $1.6 million. So there's a small anomaly here. We will correct it, but your total award cost would be $1,610,100, which means adding $120,100 as your de minimis plus the total direct cost. So the total award cost that you should, bill or indicate in your proposal will be $1,610,100. So next slides, please. I think I'll end up here, and I'll welcome Sean or the next presenter. Over to you, Sean. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Abdullah. And I'm very sorry about the total cost slide in the final the final slide that you presented. That was I made that mistake. I corrected what you had put together, and that
No problem.
made
No
it
problem,
wrong.
Sean.
So
Thanks.
in the chat box, you can see what the total cost should be for the overall project. And one thing that's important to note here in terms of the de minimis, this 10% indirect cost rate, is we really want to encourage local organizations to take advantage of using the 10% de minimis to capture costs that can go under indirect costs. This is a way that gives local organizations opportunity to grow their organization and cover things that might not normally be covered through that indirect cost. So we do want to encourage organizations to make use of the 10% de minimis. And I just wanted to see if USAID had anything they wanted to say on that.
Sean, I think you outlined it and you covered it well, the purpose behind the de minimis and what's allowable, etc., as part of the application. So thank you so much.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to turn the next couple of slides over to Vicky about fixed amount awards.
Thank you, Sean. And I'm not certain if my camera is working or not. Can you see me on camera? Sean?
No,
Your image comes
the
in and
screen is
out.
black.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I will.
Oh, there you are.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. So we will go over a few slides on the fixed amount awards, and I will just turn my camera off now to save bandwidth. Just wanted to introduce myself. Nice meeting all of you and seeing all of you. So for fixed amount awards, this is a good award mechanism to use when the award has specific goals and objectives that can be measured, and also whenever you can develop an accurate budget. The budget may be based on historical data, for example, what you've paid for certain services or activities in the past, or it could also be based on current data, staff salaries, for example. An accurate budget will help to ensure that you can cover all of your costs under the award, because you don't want to lose any money under your fixed amount award. Although you do develop a budget, you don't have to monitor actual cost incurred under a fixed amount award, because you're going to be based on completion of deliverables or milestones. Next slide, please. So in developing your budget, we've got a sample 6-month project budget here for a fixed amount award. So the purpose of this project is to identify best soup recipes in 5 provinces, and you're going to train people in order to make these recipes. The total budget amount is $49,995, so almost $50,000. And this will be a fixed amount award. So looking at this budget, you'll see that the organization will need to develop an implementation plan, complete 2 main activities, and submit a final report. So they'll need to conduct in activity 1, conduct a survey of people in each of the 5 provinces about what are the favorite soup recipes and collect the recipes. From that information, you'll go to activity 2, which will be conducted in April and May, and provide a training in each of the 5 provinces on how to make all of those favorite soups in the 5 provinces. After completing these 2 activities, there will be a final report that will be submitted on the targets and the goals achieved. For example, what were the recipes identified and how many people were trained to make them? For an FAA, the organization needs milestone payments for submitting milestone deliverables. So they receive funding amounts needed to do the activities and complete the deliverables. One approach to identifying milestone payments is to look at the project budget monthly cost over the project period. So for the sample that we're showing here, it said this is a 6-month budget. So each month's budget is a different amount because they're going to be doing different activities for each month. For example, you see that for the first 3 months, January through March, they're going to be doing activity 1, which is conducting the survey. For April and May, they're going to be doing activity 2, which is conducting the training. The last month, in June, they'll be writing a final report. One way to figure out milestone payments is to look at how much funding is needed to complete the main activities. For example, if you look at the first activity during the surveys during January through March, it's going to be about $25,500 if we add up the totals for January, February, and March. The second main activity, which is doing the trainings in April and May, these 2 months of work is going to cost about $21,000 to complete the trainings. For the first milestone payment, the organization wants enough money up front in order to start the project and complete the first activity, which is the survey. If some smaller organizations may not have the startup money needed in order to start work immediately. So you want to propose an initial deliverable that is relatively easy for the organization to go on and start working and implementing the work of the award. The next slide that we'll go over will show possible milestone payments and deliverables. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a sample milestone payment schedule. And generally, the milestone payment schedule will include a description of the milestone, verification documentation, or what is needed to make sure that to document that the milestone has been completed, a fixed amount that will be paid based upon completion of the milestone, and the completion date. So this table shows 4 possible milestones that are And this is related to the budget that we showed on the previous slide. The first milestone is a implementation plan. This will list the project activities that will be done, when they will be done, who's responsible, and details such as that. This is due by the middle of the first month, by January 15th. Once this first milestone is completed and approved, the donor will provide $25,500 in funding to start implementing the project. So that's enough funding to cover the first 3 months of the project. And then remember, in those first 3 months, January, February, and March, we were going to be doing the survey. The next milestone is completing the 5 surveys and submitting a survey report. For that approved and completed deliverable, the organization is paid $18,000. So this will be enough to carry the budget and to take care of the budget for the next 2 months of the project. The third milestone, which is the 5 training sessions, can be approved and paid once you have training materials and signed attendance sheets. You will be paid, the donor will pay the organization $4,000 when those are submitted. The last milestone is the final report, which is due by June 30th. And for this last milestone, once the final report is completed and approved, you will be paid an amount of $2,495. So at the end of the award period, this 6-month award period, and upon completion of these 4 milestones, the organization will have received the full amount of the fixed amount award of $49,995. Next slide, please. In order to sum it up a little bit, as said before, it may be critical to provide some organizations with upfront funds in order to start or continue activities and to implement the work of the award. So it's important to have an initial milestone that can be completed early on in the award period, at least within the first 14 days after the award start date, and no later than 30 days. When structuring milestones, you should ensure that the organization has adequate cash flow in order to achieve the upcoming milestones. The milestones should also provide an incentive for the organization to complete activities through the end of the award. For example, the last milestone payment may be smaller than the first couple of milestone payments, but it should be enough in order to ensure and to give an incentive for the organization to complete the final milestone. Next slide, please. And I will pass this back to Becky.
Great. Thank you, Vicki and Abdallah. And I just have 2 more slides to go through, and then we'll turn to the questions and comments from the participants. So, you've put your technical approach together, all the pieces of the technical application, you've developed your budget, you've put together your milestones for the award. So all together, we're coming to the end and we're really ready to finalize the application. So some best practices in the couple of days before submitting your application to the donor. It's really important to conduct a final review, and that includes, the format of your application to ensure it's in the correct format, it's within the page limits, it has the correct font size, paper size, page numbers, etc. All of those instructions from the call. And then also a review to ensure that your content is right. So the content to ensure that it's compliant with what the solicitation is asking for and meets that evaluation criteria. Now, with 1 or 2 days left before submission, hopefully those are just easy checks to make. But if you find a really glaring issue, then, you'll really have to work hard in those last couple of days to correct anything. But hopefully you've taken the time to review and reflect in the weeks leading up to the submission, that you're not encountering any, last minute emergencies regarding your application. And another suggestion before submission is to conduct a final copy edit. And this is just, as you would with any document that you would submit to a donor or a funder, you really want to make sure you're putting your best foot forward, and that it looks nice, that you have graphics, that you have all of it kind of formatted nicely. It's easy to read. It's legible. You don't have any words falling off a page or a graphic that's too small to read. You just really want to do those final checks to ensure that what you're sending to the donor is your best effort. Of course, the donor is not expecting anything to be perfect. When you have a limited time to put an application together, there's going to be errors, there's going to be mistakes. That's normal, and normal for any organization of any size. I've made mistakes myself in that final submission, but an on-time but imperfect submission, has a chance to win. But a perfect proposal that's submitted after the deadline never has any chance to win. So keeping that in mind, doing your best, but always meeting those final deadlines. Another suggestion I have, submit your proposal at least 1 business day before the deadline. You don't want to be submitting it, an hour or 30 minutes, before the final moment it's due, in case something goes wrong, your internet goes out, and something happens. You want that time in between to make sure that if the email doesn't go through, that you can correct any issues. And always be sure to build these final steps into your calendar, so that your team is aware of how much time you need before the deadline to get all the final pieces. And then, at submission, you're ready, you have all the documents together, you're ready to click send. Within your email, let the donor know what you've attached and ask for confirmation of the receipt of your email. You want to make sure that the donor, if possible, can confirm that, yes, we got your application ahead of the deadline, it's fine. If you use Outlook, or depending on what email application you use, you can turn on delivery receipts. That's kind of a checkbox you can use that will immediately tell you that the email went through. Another tip I would also say is, when you're submitting it, to CC others at your organization who can confirm to you that the email went through. And this is really just kind of like technical issues. If you're submitting it to the donor and nobody else is copied, you might not know something didn't go through, or you might not know. So you just really want to have someone as backup, double checking you. And I usually have somebody kind of standing over my shoulder watching me put all these documents in an email together, because you just want to make sure you're getting everything submitted. And finally, again, going back to the solicitation and checking to make sure your attachments are less than the megabyte size limit. I know with the US government, is often, a 10 or 15 megabyte limit to the attachment. So you just want to make sure your file sizes are under that, so that the email will go through properly. And again, making sure that everything's labeled properly. And, if it's too big of an email to send, you can, send multiple emails. Just make sure to label them accordingly. So those are kind of all the best tips and tricks we've come up with today. So we'll pause now for answering some questions or comments that we've received through the chat. So I will hand it back to Melissa, who's been keeping track of all of that for us. And again, if you would like to ask a question and come off mute, just raise your hand.
Great. Thanks, Becky. I think we'll first go back to the question that we put on pause from the first Q&A. And I believe Vicky is going to take this question. So just as a reminder, the question is, in a consortium-based application of a network, do you have any pointers on how sub-granting can be managed if some organizations don't meet the finance requirement threshold for being a prime, for example, being registered? Are consultancy type agreements or service level agreements acceptable?
Thanks, Melissa. I will give a response, but also ask USAID if they would like to chime in and give some additional information on this. So as far as subbing versus a consultancy versus a service contract, I think it depends on the scope of what the organization or the consultant will be doing. If it's more of a subrecipient or recipient relationship where you are actually carrying out work of the program or work of the scope of work, a subgrantee may be the better relationship, or if it's more service contracting where it's an actual procurement, needing or hiring consultant services that are pretty related to the scope of work, but ancillary to the scope, then the procurement or contractor relationship may be the better mechanism. I will mention that with our organization, whenever we do have subgrantees or subrecipients, we do a pre-award assessment. And based on the results of that pre-award assessment, the subgrantee would be given a rating of medium, high, or low risk. And based on that risk rating, we would develop a subrecipient monitoring plan in order to monitor that subrecipient. But that's not done with our consultants. That same level of pre-award assessment is not done with our service contractors or consultants. So in some, I think it depends on the scope. And also to add, some subs may not need to be registered. That requirement, I believe, would be noted in the solicitation document. So that's my comments on that. You said you have anything to add?
I can jump in and then see if Dee has anything else to add. I think you've outlined what different mechanisms for the type of work that you want, and I think different organizations can determine what is best based on how they want to work with the different organizations. I think the bigger picture is, right, when you're looking at trying to collaborate or having a consortium, it depends on the proposal itself, or the not the proposal, but the RFI or the applicant or the RFA, what you're applying to. If the intent is to collaborate and work together, I think the terminology isn't as much, but it's showing who all is involved in the programming that you're doing, and you are determining what is that best type of mechanism that I think was outlined as the pros and cons of why you might want to have a subcontract versus a service level agreement versus a consultant agreement, etc. But I think it's kind of what is the intent around what you're applying for, and making sure that that's coming up front, and however that engagement is done is really based on individual organizations. I don't know, Dee, do you have anything else to add?
Nothing on my side, thank you.
Okay, if no one else has anything to add to that question, Vicky, did you have anything to add to that question?
No, I was just thanking for that response.
Great. I see, Ron, you have your hand up. Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, I would just add that, each consortium will decide, what is the appropriate way to implement the activities that it's developed in its budget. And, if there are, consultants that need to be hired or other contractual services, those are appropriate. And just wanted to bring that specific point back to the questioner. Over.
Excellent. Thanks, Ron. The next question we have is a budget-related question. It says, in terms of reasonable unit or activity cost, would applicants be punished by reviewers if saying the rental cost for a space is more expensive than the norm if an LGBTQ organization has to use a venue or office space with higher security or a safer location, which might be higher than average? Is there space for justification in the budget narrative, and will reviewers look at this in order to understand a possibly higher cost than average in a general civil society budget?
Happy to answer this, and any of my colleagues can chime in, but I would say yes, you're not going to be punished. What might happen is USAID might come back and ask a question, but as you've mentioned, the budget narrative is where you can put in your justification for this maybe out of the ordinary or higher cost. So I would definitely use that space, and there are generally never any page limits on your budget narrative. So definitely use that space to explain, why it might be a higher cost and what is going into that, what is adding to the cost. And if you note that you need security or hold it in a different location, then you might do, an unrelated training, and that accounts for why the cost is different. Definitely take advantage of using the budget narrative to make that justification. If the donor has further questions, they may come back and ask you for further justification or quotes to show that you shopped around to get the best price. But ultimately, if you need to make use a higher cost facility for safety or security, I think the donor would understand that.
USAID, is there anything that you'd like to add to that response? Thanks, Becky, for that.
No, I think the response was perfect. Thank you.
Great. The next question we have is about the 10% de minimis. It says, can the 10% de minimis be used by organizations to place an interest-bearing account? Perhaps Abdullah, you could take this question.
Yes, I mean, there is a requirement in the US regs that any money that they give to you, you need to keep it in the interest-bearing account. But the caveat is that you can keep it up to, I think, $200. The rest you need to inform to pay it back to USAID. So yes, they need to do that under regs, but I'm not sure under FAA because it's milestone, and they're kind of reimbursed once they complete the milestone, so they won't have any cash even on hand. So, but yeah, broadly, yes, it's a requirement of USAID that they need to keep in the interest-bearing account. Over to you. Thank you.
Just to jump in, so this question specifically was about the de minimis. And I just heard you say that they did returning of funds to USAID. So can you just clarify that, Abdullah?
Oh, for de minimis.
Yeah, the question specifically on de minimis, not on the project funds.
Yeah, because de minimis is meant to cover the indirect cost. So the presumption is the 10% that they are requesting, they're going to cover those costs which are not going to be charged directly to project. So, so if there's any excess on that, I'll defer that question maybe to USAID. By my understanding, if you have any surplus amount, you can keep it under interest-bearing account. Yeah. Over to you. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to add?
Yeah,
go,
I mean,
go ahead,
since
Sean.
this is it's a fixed amount award, so you do have this budget that you have developed for the project, and you have calculated your 10% de minimis based on that budget. So you have the amount that is considered that you can cover your indirect costs with. but this is also a fixed amount award. So you figured out your costs, you've developed your milestone payments, or you've agreed with the donor about what your milestone deliverables and payments will be. And once you are submitting each of those deliverables, you are paid that amount. And that's, that you're doing what you need to do in terms of the donor. You do have to keep records for the project for 3 years, but you don't have to provide additional information. So if you're able to complete the deliverables with less, cheaper than what you estimated originally, and they're approved, then those funds can be channeled back into your, other activities. But I will turn it over to see if anybody else on the panel has anything they'd like to add. Well, let's move on to the next question. And I do want to note that we are at the top of the hour. We can continue to answer questions, but we do just want to note that we are at the top of the hour. We will stay to finish answering the questions. The recording will be made available, and we can provide additional responses as well to some of the questions if we don't get to cover them all during this time period. I'll turn it back over to Melissa.
Thanks, Sean. We have another question here about the de minimis. Can you explain the 10% de minimis rate, not necessarily the calculation, but perhaps more generally, and who or how an organization qualifies for it?
Well, yeah, so I can take it. So as long as you don't have any negotiated indirect cost rate agreement with USAID, then you're eligible for 10% de minimis. And you can apply to your award. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, Abdullah, perhaps you can give just a brief description of what the 10% de minimis rate is. I think that's part one of this question.
Oh yeah, so like the wording 10%, I think is 10% applicable to modified total direct cost. So the rate is 10% at the moment. Of recently, I think we have heard that USAID is reconsidering the rate, but so far at the moment is 10%, as the name indicates.
And any of the organizations, I would think that most, if not all, of the local organizations that we are working with in Namibia don't have negotiated indirect cost rates. So they can, and they are eligible, they do qualify to use the 10% de minimis rate. That's just part of the USAID regulations. Any of those organizations that don't have already a different negotiated indirect rate can always use a 10% de minimis rate. Okay, next question.
The last question we have currently, this came, Vicky, this will be directed to you. It came before you really went into detail, but it says, can you please explain the milestone payments again? So the project must be done first to be able to get the funding, is that correct? So perhaps a little bit of clarity around that.
Thanks, Melissa. No, the entire project does not have to be done first, but if you remember the table with the 4 deliverables that we had. The first one, I believe, was the implementation plan. So once that first milestone is approved and was completed and approved, then you would be paid that 25,500. And I believe the completion date was January 15th. So once each milestone is completed, then you would be paid that fixed amount upon the completion of each milestone based on this milestone payment schedule, which has the amount that you would be paid along with the completion date for each of the milestones. Does that answer your question?
I think that gets at the question. We'll wait for that participant to see if there's any follow-up questions. But other than that, those are all of the questions we currently have. If anyone else has any additional questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or in the chat now. Becky, I think we also had one more poll, so perhaps we can do this while anyone else may have any last minute questions, but go ahead, Becky.
Yeah, so thank you all for joining, and I just wanted to do one last poll before we formally close the session. Just want to kind of gauge, do you feel more confident at the end of this webinar to pull a compliant application together for future submissions? So 1 being no confidence to 5 being very confident. I'm hoping that the material we went through today will make you feel better about submitting applications for funding in the future. So please just go ahead and answer the poll and we'll share the results and then we'll close out the webinar.
Just give everybody a few more seconds if you'd like to participate.
Okay, I'm glad to see that we're feeling medium to very confident. That's great to see. Really appreciate you coming today and participating. So I'm going to turn it over to Sean just to close us out and provide any further instructions.
Thank you so much, Becky, and thank you everyone for participating today in this webinar. We really appreciate your making yourself available, and we hope this has been useful. So just want to thank you, and I would like to turn it over to Dee to make the final comments. Dee?
Hi, Sean. Thank you so much. And I just want to say thank you to everybody who attended the webinar. We really hope that this was helpful for everyone now and in the future. I want to also thank our partner ASAP for putting it all together, especially at such short notice. And we really wanted to create a resource for the communities in Namibia. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. And I think now we can stop the recording.
Yeah, so I do want to make sure everybody knows after the webinar,